Why don't we take the question and then have Professor Dworkin respond? Yes, go ahead. Go, please. No, please.
It's just the last two speakers, basically what they make of this idea of kind of variable political obligation and how that fits into their idea that perhaps this is a really radical critique.
You get to field the questions.
Well, I'm not sure I get the question exactly. The idea that it's a matter of degrees rather than an all or nothing matter, how does it feel within the general theory of Professor Dworkin?
Whether it really is that kind of radical a critique, if it is a variable idea.
Oh,
of
okay,
political
sorry.
obligation.
Yeah, so I imagine Professor Dworkin might respond in the following way to the worry we had. I would, but I will see soon what he tells us. But something like, yes, I am acknowledging that political obligation holds, but except for those laws that outrage dignity. So political obligation would just hold generally and fail only for those laws. And furthermore, would fail for the victims of the system. And those occasions might warrant civil disobedience and other kinds of things. Of course, reform within the system. We think, however, that dignity is more demanding than that would allow. So I don't quite see how. Well, the idea is that in the partnership democracies, political obligation prevails. So is to the full degree, right? I'm sorry.
Yes.
If I recall correctly, I think the the idea of obligation flows from the fact that you are part of a community that is participating in creating a coercive structure that affects others. And I guess my question on reading this, as I recall it, was, now that we live in such a globalized world, if, for example, you have the United States go in and attack Iraq, then does that mean that we as United States citizens, who having elected George W. Bush, bear an obligation now to the people of Iraq that is much more robust than we ordinarily would have?
Who's supposed to be directing? No, you're supposed to be directing to the panel. To whom on the panel was your question directed?
I'm sorry, it's a general question or to Professor Dworkin?
Or should I? Maybe this is the appropriate time to let Professor Dworkin respond.
Thank you. Very, very good question. But let me go back and start with Kwame, and then just have a few comments about each of these. To center on what I think is the most important issue you raise, and then I'll turn to a very important issue you might have raised but didn't. The important issue is this. What is the proper direction of argument between the ideas of respect for others and wrong? Do we argue that you first have to decide what's wrong, and then you take how you show respect for others from that, or vice versa? Now, I see the difficulty of this, but I'm tempted to think that the following question makes sense asked by someone before he's formed his attitude. Start with the first person deliberation rather than criticism by others. Does the following question make sense? Do I show? What is the correct interpretation of what I am about to do. In these circumstances, would others be justified in believing or in refusing to attribute to me the proper concern, proper level of concern with people in general? Would I be justified later in congratulating myself that I have shown the respect I should? Now, I'm trying to explore the extent to which that question can have answers that comport with our convictions about what's right and what's wrong. I myself don't think the other direction is as profitable, because I'm not sure that we have an account of what's wrong sufficiently independent of that as a general account to make it work. So I agree with you that the question is a very deep one about what the direction of argument should be. And I'm now tempted, but I will continue thinking, to suppose that dignity as defined, not, in the air, not as misused by many people, but dignity as defined in these principles can play the role. And I agree with you, and thank you for raising that issue. Now, in your written paper, you make a suggestion with which I fully agree, but you didn't have time to raise it here. And that is the suggestion that if my argument is in general right, we have a duty to work towards an international regime for not just aid, I would say an international regime of law protecting oppressed and weak people, which I think myself includes a responsibility to intervene in certain circumstances. I do think we have that duty, and I thank you again for suggesting it. John, about my marvelous sensitivity to political shifts of the wind, which I wish I had. I feel duty-bound to say that when I first made this argument, I deplore this fact, of course. I'm going to say 1981, but others will say early. So it's not a recent conversion on my part. Now, I think a distinction that I make, and perhaps should emphasize more, is pertinent to many of your concerns. And that is the distinction between doing a good job, living well, and having a good life. You talk about oppressed women in societies that are unfair, in which their lives can't really, I would say, can't be good. And if they respond to that situation in an appropriate way, then I think they live well. That is, I don't think that we can dismiss the oppression, but neither do I think it ought to corrupt the possibility of their meeting the most fundamental ethical possibility. About my elitism and Joe the plumber, and the person who muddles through and lives with quiet piety, I need to know more about whether there really was any attempt to explore other ways of living, an attempt to see. I offer an example in the text of somebody who falls into a life of religious devotion without ever having asked any question about the basis of the conviction that underlies this. And I do think such a person lacks dignity. So I fear I may be succumbing to elitism, but I fear that many people do lead lives so unreflective. Not Dora, I approve of her, of course, But some people do lead lives so innocent of any reflection, so innocent of any ethical imagination, that I think they're doing themselves an injustice. But in defense against the charge of elitism, and in defense against the charge that I'm absorbing and trying to turn the conservative technique, as you mentioned, the only life, no. I speak of two lives with contempt. One, the life of collecting matchbook covers, but pertinent to my defense against the charge of pandering to the economic right. Making money, I say, is just as contemptible. Francis, I'm glad that you're glad that I've turned my attention to the trolley problem. But I haven't turned my attention to it in the way that you would approve of. Because my main effort in that discussion is to try and find more general principles for, may I say, more realistic cases, more realistic confrontations, more realistic dilemmas that could explain why in a philosophy seminar room we have the reactions we do to ingenious questions about runaway trolleys. And I argue that there are two principles that we are correct in accepting in general. And these are the principles that what I call competitive harm is not, we do no wrong typically in inflicting competitive harm, and that includes the case where we save one person and can't therefore save another. On the other hand, we do wrong in many quite realistic situations when we intervene in someone's life because we think a better use of his life would be sacrificial. I believe that explains two things. First, why we have the reactions we do to the, let me say, first-order trolley cases, and second, why we're puzzled, as I am, about the loop case. That won't satisfy you, but I want to say that I'm not trying to offer let's say, an account of the loop case that would make sense, other than to say, I want to explain why we're puzzled by it. Kenneth, I hope it isn't as bad as you describe. I must reread the pertinent section. But I hope what I find when I do is that I say that these three factors are factors that we must recognize as pushing in different directions, and that the resolution of the possible conflict among them would be one that it would be impossible to specify in advance. So yes, if we can save some child from a broken leg or a life of snake trauma at little cost to ourselves, that is certainly what we should do. The question of rescuing the trapped miners and the hypothetical insurance policy I find intriguing and difficult. I believe that in a case in which, a world in which real insurance was on offer, and maybe with any luck we'll take a step closer to that world soon, that in that case people would be making the choice for themselves, and they would not have the funds to afford, they would have the funds to afford palliative care, and it would come to be understood that that is sensible. the fact that they themselves had made that decision and enjoyed the benefit of it would distinguish the case from the trapped miners, I believe, in which society had made the choice, and the payment for that choice was being made by a few people. Finally, the argument by Suzanne and Candice about legitimacy. I'm persuaded by a good deal of your argument. First, I accept, and I think it's an important improvement, that it is not just those who are second-class citizens whose responsibility to obey the law is diminished. I think everyone is, and I accept that. There is, however, a question, once we introduce the scale of degree, whether the general obligation in the community, though diminished, is not extinguished. Whereas I think that in the cases that I have in mind, the responsibility is actually extinguished for the people who are the direct victims. So I want to agree with you that this does touch the obligation, but though I have to examine it further, I'm reluctant to say that the impact on the two groups is the same. I think introducing the notion of a matter of degree is, I think, important, but I also concede evasive. Because now I can say in response to all your questions, oh, well, it's just a matter of degree. And I want to close these remarks by saying I'm uncomfortable just saying that. But I'm also uncomfortable just saying nobody ever has an obligation to obey the law. So I'm going to have to attempt to provide at least indices of by how much and what the consequences are. I thank you very much.
This has been terrific. Thank you to all of the panelists today, and thanks most of all to Professor Dworkin. We'll resume tomorrow with a couple of panels on politics and justice, concluding with Professor Dworkin's response. For now, we'll have a reception outside. Thank you.